Got to ask a big question this morning. Who is the GOAT? Some of you may not have a clue what that means. There's amongst sports fans, there's this conversation about who is the greatest of all time. So that's what that question means. Who is the GOAT? Who is the greatest of all time? And that conversation gets really spicy, real fiery when it comes to basketball. Mostly amongst the younger generation versus older generation. So I'm going to ask, is Michael Jordan the GOAT? Raise your hand. Is LeBron James the GOAT? Raise your hand. Wow. I'm proud of him, though, for being the guy that's like, you know what? All right. And then there's the All right, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, raise your hand. Donna. Hey, Lemoyne's here, too. All right. Joe Montana, raise your hand. Ronnie raised his hand. So, get to the real one. Peyton Manning, raise your hand. Tom Brady, raise your hand. John Elway, raise your hand. Ah, boy, Dave. And if you're a fool, you think that Patrick Mahomes is already the GOAT. Oh, here. Okay, and so it's a question that gets thrown around, and people get hot. It's a conversation that gets spicy. People go after each other over, well, you just clearly don't understand sports. You don't understand football if you think so-and-so's the GOAT, right? But across the board, most football fans will look at Jerry Rice and put him in the conversation across the board, greatest of all time. But then you kind of get into these different subcategories, like who's the greatest big guy in basketball of all time? When I mean big man, I'm talking like Shaquille O'Neal, right? Because you talk about quarterbacks, or you talk about linebackers, or you talk about the defense as a whole, or maybe you start getting into who's greatest kicker, who's the greatest punter. No one really has that conversation. No one's gonna. But today, in the scripture, we're going to see that Jesus is the GOAT. He's the greatest of all time. That's what Matthew is doing as he is writing to these Jewish Christians in the book of Matthew. He is demonstrating that Jesus is the GOAT. See, the Jews had all these people in history, all the patriarchs of the faith. And there was some that are like, no, David's the GOAT. He's the greatest of all. No, Moses, he's the greatest. Abraham, come on, can you beat Abraham? He's the greatest of all time. And we sang the song a little bit ago, that Jesus is the true and better Adam. I don't think there was anybody that's like, oh, Adam's the GOAT. No, everybody was kind of like, no, he's not. We would prefer that he didn't do what he did, right? But we sang about this. Jesus is the true and better Isaac. He's the true and better David. And so this morning we're going to look at Jesus being, just using common language for even young people now. He's the GOAT. He's the greatest of all time. See, in Matthew, go ahead, if you haven't already, turn your Bible to Matthew. At the very beginning of Matthew, we have this really weird 17 verses. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, I've read a lot of biographies, even autobiographies, and sometimes they get into background of somebody, but never this extensive. Okay? We're not going to read the whole thing. Jesus Christ is verse 1. Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham, the father of Isaac. And Isaac, the father of Jacob. And Jacob, the father of Judah and his brothers. And Judah, the father after Perez. And Zerah by Tamar. Okay, so whenever I get to this point in my Bible reading, like my quiet time, there are times in the Bible reading plan I have where that's all I read in that part of Matthew that day, and boy, do I feel uplifted, right? You can laugh, it's fine. Right? You read the genealogy of Jesus, and you're not coming away from like, come on today, right? It's kind of, what's it doing here? Why would I want to read this? Well, here's the reason. It's really not actually there for you unless you are a Jew. See, because what Matthew is writing, he's writing to Jews, he's putting the genealogy of Jesus Christ, and here's what he's saying. He's saying that Jesus has got street cred. Jesus is from around here. Jesus goes way back. Look at, it's kind of like he's paid his dues. Like, look who Jesus is. And being able to give an account of someone's genealogy, especially for the Jews, it meant something. Knowing where you were from or who you came from, like that means something, right? In sports, it's the dumbest thing to me, but whenever you're watching a football game, you got, somebody, some lineman from somewhere that says, hey, I went to the University of Southern California, right? Like, I don't know why that's there, but apparently it's important to know where someone has come from, right? And it's a conversation around here. You'll be talking to somebody, and at some point you'll kind of be like, oh, you're from around here, right? Or sometimes you'll be having a conversation with somebody, and you'll be like, you're not from around here. Right? I was asked one time if Gower had a Walmart. You're not from around here. Right? But here's what Matthew is doing in the beginning of the book of Matthew. He is communicating to the Jews that Jesus is one, he's from around here, and the man has a lineage that is hard to compare to. But all of this has to do with demonstrating to the Jews that Jesus is the greatest of all time. He's a Jew's Jew, right? There's no one more Jew than Jesus. If you ever see a picture of Jesus and he has blonde hair and blue eyes, toss it. That ain't a picture of Jesus. Jesus was a Jew. He was a Hebrew. One time, Megyn Kelly said on Fox News that Jesus was a white man. And I heard Pastor Matt Chandler say following that week, finding a white man in first century Galilee would be like finding a leprechaun riding a unicorn at the bottom of a rainbow with a pot of gold. You're not going to find it. It's not there. It's not real. Jesus wasn't a white guy. He was a Hebrew. And looking at his genealogy, he is a serious and legit Hebrew. And that's further demonstrated by where Jesus has to go whenever the census is taken. So, we sing the song, "O Little Town of Bethlehem." That's because Jesus' earthly father was from the city of David, because they're related to David. So they go to Bethlehem. But now, get to chapter 2. I want to look. Go to verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born king of the Jews?" Remember, we talked a few weeks ago, all right? The wise men see the star, and they come from the east, probably from like Iran or something is where they were probably from. So they come from the east. They're looking for the king. They had read about this prophecy in the Old Testament that a star would come out of Israel, and so they show up to where you would think the announcement would be made. We were talking with our little girls on Christmas Eve about who you would tell, like who's the first person you would tell if you had a baby, right? And so we talked about in church how it's really strange that God made his announcement to shepherds. And the wise men think it's strange as well because they go straight to the king. Like, well, if another king's been born, the king would probably know, right? But they get there and they say, "Where is he, the King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose. We've come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the child was to be born. He doesn't even know his own book. Herod, he's not a Hebrew of Hebrews. He's what they would have called at the time a half-breed. Right? You look at Jesus, you see his genealogy, it's legit. Like, he's a Jew. There's no denying it. He is from Israel. Israel, namely, being the man Jacob who wrestled with God and had his name changed. When we talk about Israel, we're not talking about just a nation. We're talking about a people group. We're talking about specifically a family. Right? Jacob and Esau. Jacob goes and he wrestles with God, and after he wrestles with God, his name is changed to Israel. So when you talk about Israel, you're talking about a family. And it's important to know as a Jew where down the family tree you line up where you fit. Now Herod, he doesn't have that kind of credential. He's kind of in power because he's buddies with so-and-so and Caesar, and so it's a political deal. And so Herod, who was relying on politics instead of God's input, is nervous at the thought that another king is showing up. Verse 7, Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I may too come and worship him." Which we all know he did not mean. But he told them where to go look. After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that had been seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshiped him. You know, they gave the gifts because they recognize him. He's the King of Kings. He's the King of Kings. So here's these, we call them wise men, three kings, the Magi. They were probably a combination of all three, going and bowing before the King of Kings. But now, looking at verse 13, and when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." So, Herod, scoundrel, scumbag, sends his soldiers to Bethlehem to kill all the baby boys 2 years and younger. God sends an angel, another messenger, in a dream to Joseph, get up and get to Egypt. You know, Herod, he's just nervous about a political threat. He doesn't care about worshiping Jesus. So what does Joseph do? He does what he has been conditioned to do, and that is listen to angels. Right? All throughout the Christmas narrative, angels show up and everybody's afraid, and they have just learned, all right, we do what the angels say because so far it hasn't let us down. So they jump up and they exodus and they bolt out of there and they head to Egypt. If you look at a map, for us, actually a drive from like Bethlehem to Egypt, it's like half a day. It's really not bad. But when you're on foot, a whole different ball game. But they bolt out of there, they go to Egypt, and the scripture says, this is the end of verse 15, this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Now here's what Matthew is saying. Matthew is writing this to Jewish believers. He is saying to them, he's quoting to them from Hosea chapter 11. So turn there. Hosea chapter 11. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea. Look for Daniel and turn right. When we read in Matthew, you guys are working on Hosea. When we read in Matthew, out of Egypt I call my son, this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Hopefully you know about messianic prophecies. Hopefully you know that a lot of what Matthew does is to demonstrate to the reader that Jesus fulfills these prophecies about the Messiah. He is the Messiah. He's the one that's been promised. But here's the thing. If we read Hosea, we're going to find out that this isn't a messianic prophecy. Chapter 1, verse 11. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. That doesn't have anything to do with a Messiah. So what the heck is Matthew doing? When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. You see, Israel is like an adopted child to God. Chose him. God revealed himself to the world. After the garden, there's this chasm, there's this separation. And relating with God is hard. They see God work and God communicates in a certain way, but it's not like any other relationship. It's certainly not like it used to be in the garden when they would just go for walks with God. But then at one point, God speaks to this man named Abram. Not because Abraham had come to him. God spoke to Abram. God called Abram. You ever returned a phone call? And you're like, hey, what's up? And they're like, I don't know, what's up? Your response is, you called me. Right? God called Abraham. Abraham wasn't looking for a God. He was already pretty content, I think, with the God that he had. Most likely he worshipped the moon god Nana. The Chaldeans worshipped this moon god named Nana. And it was all about the cycles of the moon. They offered sacrifices. So he had himself a God. He was good. He was content in his religion. His life wasn't the way he wanted it to be. So then God calls him. God called Abraham. And God starts making promises to Abraham, saying, you're going to be a great nation. And what does Abraham and his wife do? They kind of snicker at the thought that oh, okay, yeah, right, we're old. I don't know if you know how this works, God, but when you're old, you can't exactly have kids. Right? They didn't have, the support that we have now, but I mean, they're way too old to be having children. But God calls Abraham, and he's going to make a nation out of Abraham, he's going to make this nation. You see, God chose Abraham, God adopted Abraham to be representatives to the world. God wanted a relationship with his creation. And so God calls Abraham and starts developing this people, this family, so that he can relate and reveal himself to the world. I remember my mom and dad, when they adopted my little brother and my little sister, I remember the first time meeting them, and we're sitting in this like playroom, nursery type room. And here's this jittery little black kid right in front of me. I'm like, we're taking him home? I was 15, so I knew everything. But I remember this stranger coming to live with us, and this other little stranger coming to live with us. And yesterday we celebrated Christmas together, and they weren't strangers. Because over time, you build this relationship, you get to know each other, you start to become a family. But at the time when we first met them, Mom and Dad went as representatives to meet Matthew and Esther. Like, hey, we're the representatives of this family, just to see how things would go, see how things would mesh. See, and that's what God did when he called Abraham, when he called Israel. He was calling for himself not spoiled only children. He was calling people to himself to be representatives to the world. God's plan the whole time was for all people to be offered redemption. Israel, they just couldn't get it through their heads that that was their job. They wanted all the blessing and they wanted to be doted on, and they wanted God to clean up their messes, and they wanted a relationship with God like a lot of selfish kids want a relationship with their parents. Like, you're here to clean up for me, and my job is to live my life my own way. Don't get in between that. But that's not what God meant. God meant for Israel to be his child, to love him, to worship. Israel will worship him and represent God to the world around him. Whenever our little girls go to some friends' houses, we usually have this conversation like, now listen, at their house they have different rules. Anybody had this conversation with their kids for a play? We're like, hey, this house we've got different, they may have different rules. Our rules in our house still apply. Right? Yesterday was frustrating because you go to grandparents' house. And what do the kids want to do? Throw all the normal rules out the window because we're at Dodie's house and we're at Mama's house and all the sugar is allowed and we get to throw things and do whatever. And then you got to go home and pretend like that never happened. Right? We tell our little girls, listen, you're going out from our house, but the rules still apply. And Israel was never good at taking the rules with them. They'd go to Canaan and they'd start sacrificing their children to these other gods. They went into Egypt and they exploded. And they ended up becoming slaves. And what did God do when his kids went to this place and became slaves? He called this man Moses out of Egypt to go back to Egypt to get his kids and bring them home. Because when Israel was a child, I loved him and I called him out of Egypt. I called my son out of Egypt. But look at verse 2, Hosea 11, verse 2. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to Baals and burnt offerings. Israel's job is to demonstrate that God is good. They're the representatives to the world. They're supposed to be showing off who God is to the world around them. And what does Israel do? They sacrifice to this cow. After God saves them from the Egyptian army, they start sacrificing to this cow. And at some points, when they're in the promised land, they revert to the religions of the Canaanites. And God hated the Canaanites. Listen to me. God hated the Canaanites. You know why? They'd take their precious little children and they would sacrifice them to gods. They'd take their little babies and they'd put them on a cast iron skillet. God hates that. I hate that. You hate that. And Israel is going for a playover and starts doing what everybody else is doing. God's patient, though, with his son, Israel. He calls him out of Egypt. So this is what Matthew is talking about. Turn back to Matthew chapter 2. Verse 15. Matthew chapter 2, verse 15. Joseph takes Mary and baby Jesus to Egypt. Until Herod is gone, the threat against Jesus' life is neutralized. And then out of Egypt comes Jesus. And Matthew says this is to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. To fulfill, right? There's the question about a prophecy. See, the prophet writes, but that doesn't mean that he is prophesying. But here's the thing. Here's the point. If you look at the beginning of Matthew, I want you to go home. I want you to read Matthew, and I want you to hear about how Jesus fulfills all this stuff, right? He fulfills all these things in the Old Testament. But here's what we are finding here. They run off to Egypt. To escape death. And that's exactly why Israel went there. In the Old Testament, Israel runs off to Egypt to escape a famine and to escape death. So you see here this parallel of Jesus and Israel escaping to Egypt. And then God calls his son out of Egypt. And then what does Israel do when they've been called out of Egypt? They just start sacrificing to different gods. But what does Jesus do? He teaches in the temple as a little boy. He's obedient to his dad. His earthly dad, his heavenly dad. He's obedient. So what is Jesus? He's better at being Israel than Israel. He's the true and better Israel. He's the goat. It's the greatest of all time. We sang this morning. Christ is the true and better Adam, Son of God and Son of man. Now listen to this. Jesus was tempted in the garden. Who else was tempted in the garden? Adam was. But Jesus never yielded and never sinned. And listen to this. We sang this. Christ, the true and better Isaac, humble son of sacrifice. Jesus, he climbed the fearful mountain there and offered up his life. Christ is the true and better Moses, called to lead a people home. Standing bold to earthly powers, God's glory, God's great glory to be known. Christ, the true and better David. He's a lowly shepherd